Hola a todos. Hello, everyone. My name is Sonia, and I'm very glad to be part of these e-seminars organized by Alex from the Psychology Department at the Universitat de les Illes Balears. I did the psychology degree and the master in neuroscience both at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, and now I'm doing my PhD in London at the Cognitive Neuroscience Research Unit at City University of London. In this seminar, I would like to talk about action understanding and body representation in our brain. In my PhD, I study the neural correlates of action understanding with a specific interest in the role of somatosensory and motor cortices when processing body-related information. With this seminar, what I want is to give you an overview of the research area and to show you a bit more in detail the latest studies and experiments from the lab. So let's start. Yes. So here, this is an index or a summary of the ideas that I will walk you through during this seminar. I will start briefly introducing, giving you a bit of a framework of what is it, an action, body movement, and then the classical brain areas that have been studied to represent our body. Then I will tell you about the discovery of the mirror neurons and what are the implications from that discovery. So what would be the properties of that mirror neurons, and some experimental work trying to find out whether there were mirror neurons in humans. From there, I will give you an overview of how research has developed into idea of an action observation network in humans. And towards the end, I will focus a bit more on body representation, and I will show you some of the latest research that goes beyond perception, research that has been done in my lab, and some experiments connected to my PhD. Okay, so we could say that movement is something central in our lives. We move to survive, to interact with others, to express emotions, and we also observe others' movements in order to understand, to learn, to imitate. But let's start with a definition. So as stated by the Oxford English Dictionary, we can define action as with reference to a person or other entity regarded as capable of acting in an intentional manner, or the performance of some activity or deed typically to achieve an objective. Okay, in this context, we will define action as a goal-oriented movement, and it includes a wide variety of voluntary movements from any daily activities such as preparing your morning coffee and drinking it, to professional sports or artistic performance. Now, here we can see what would be the classical brain areas related to our body. If we look, let me see, yeah. If we look here at the central sulcus, which divides the frontal from the parietal lobe, we will see that anterior to it here is the primary motor cortex, and posterior to it here is the primary somatosensory cortex. What we know is both the motor and the somatosensory primary cortex are have a somatotopic representation of our bodies. Here in blue, we can see the somatosensory cortex, and here in red, we can see the motor cortex. basically we see what would be the representation of our body parts and how much do they cover in terms of the brain areas. And here on the top right of the slide, we can see what would be the motor homunculus, which is the representation of body parts in our primary motor cortex. And as we see, it doesn't necessarily represent a proportional, no, it's not necessarily proportional to our real body, right? Okay, so that's a bit of the classical knowledge that we have about body representation in our brain. Now, if we go back to the summary, well, we've seen already the brief framework that I wanted to give you. Now let's move into the discovery of mirror neurons. Okay, here we can see part of the team that worked on the discovery of mirror neurons. There's Giacomo Rizzolatti and Vittorio Galese. They're both professors of human physiology at the University of Parma. And now one of the funniest things about it is that the discovery that was going to change the way that we look at the somatosensory and motor cortex occurred by accident. They were recording single cell activity in macaque monkeys while they were executing certain actions. And in one of the breaks of the experiment, they discovered that some neurons were also responding in a very similar way. When the monkey observed someone, either another monkey or an experimenter, performing the same movement. So basically, they found these neurons with visual motor properties, both in the premotor and parietal cortices, and they call them mirror neurons or specular neurons because they seem to mirror the observed movement into your own motor system. They also proposed that mirror neurons would form a system for matching observation and execution of motor actions and implying a role here in action recognition. Okay, now let's see what are the properties of these mirror neurons. Let's start defining it. So what are the mirror neurons? Okay, they are neurons that activate both during action execution and action observation. Where do we find them? We find them mostly in the premotor and parietal cortex. And then let's see what are the properties that have been studied in these neurons. So the first property would be that they are motor and visual. So they have motor properties because they respond while doing an action, and they have visual properties because they respond while seeing an action. That would make them multimodal neurons. Another property is that they have a high congruency between the action they execute and the action they visually respond to. This would suggest a one-to-one mapping from the observed action to the action that I have in my motor repertoire. But what else is there for the mirror neurons, no? What do they respond to? Do they respond just to the movement per se, or do they respond to the goal of that action? Well, that was the question that Umirta et al. Made on their 2001 paper, and they showed that, well, this is a paper that you can see here on the screen. It's called I Know What You're Doing and Your Physiological Study. They were using both transitive and intransitive actions, and in some of them, they were showing the whole action, and in some others, they were hiding the last part. of that action. They basically, with this experiment, they showed that a subset of mirror neurons became active during action presentation, and also, when the final part of that action, which is crucial in triggering the response in full vision, was hidden and could therefore only be inferred, okay? So they implied that the motor representation of an action, which is performed by others, can be internally generated in the observer's premotor cortex, even when a visual description of the action is lacking, okay? Therefore, this would support the hypothesis that the mirror neuron activation could be at the basis of action recognition. Let's see more properties. Okay, the question behind this next paper that we're seeing here would be whether these mirror neurons only respond to hand actions, because all the other experiments were done with hand actions, or do they also respond to different body parts? Well, in this paper by Ferrari et al. In 2003, they described the mirror responses of F5 neurons that motorically code mouth actions, okay? The results showed that about 1/3 of the mouth motor neurons also discharge when the monkey observes another individual performing. Basically, the majority of these mouth mirror neurons were responding to mouth actions related to ingestive functions. But also the most effective visual stimuli in triggering them were the communicative mouth gestures. So from here we can conclude that the mirror neuron properties go beyond hands. Okay, let's see the next one. Well, this is a very interesting study that will try to answer to the question that is this perception and execution coupling exclusive to the visual modality, or can we find it in other modalities? So in this study, Kohler et al. In 2002, they found that neurons in the monkey premotor cortex, which discharge when the animal performs a specific action, and it would also discharge when it hears the related sound. So most of those neurons that would respond to hearing the action and performing the action would also discharge when the monkey observes the same action. Basically, they stated that these audiovisual mirror neurons code actions independently of whether these actions are performed, heard, or seen. Now, this study was extremely interesting, as potentially it could help clarifying the origin of language. Because the monkey F5 area is the homologue of Broca's area in humans. And these audiovisual mirror neurons are coding abstract contents, like, for example, the meaning of actions, and they're having this auditory access, which is typical of human language. So this would be an important property of mirror neurons, showing that they work across modalities, because hearing an action was also activating the mirror neurons. And basically, well, we've seen some studies, we've seen some of the properties of these mirror neurons, and this is all very interesting. but this was all done in monkeys. So we still have to show that there is a mirror-neuron system in humans, okay? Let's see if we can find out. For that, I'm gonna show you now a series of experiments using different neuroimaging and neurophysiologic techniques, which are trying to support this claim, okay, that there is a mirror-neuron system in humans. The first study is a TMS study. TMS stands for transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it was done by Fadiga et al. In 1995. The assumption underlying this experiment was that if the observation of a movement activates the premotor cortex in humans, this activation should induce an enhancement in the motor evoked potentials that are elicited by the magnetic stimulation of the motor cortex. Basically, they showed that in the absence of movement, okay, the observation of an action automatically recruits neurons that would normally be active when the subject executes that action. From that, they conclude that the motor system, both in human and monkey, is not only devoted to the production of movements, but also it is involved in the recognition. Okay, so that was the conclusion from that first study in humans. Let's see some other studies. Here, we have this study from Molenbergs and colleagues. They did a meta-analysis of 125 human fMRI studies. fMRI stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. And they revealed that there were 14 separate clusters in which activation was consistently attributed to brain regions with mirror properties. Those 14 separate clusters were encompassing 9 different Brodmann areas. Basically, these clusters, they were located in areas that were meant to be, the areas with mirror properties in the macaque, such as the inferior parietal lobe, the inferior frontal gyrus, and the adjacent ventral premotor cortex. But surprisingly, they also found regions such as the primary visual cortex, the cerebellum, and some parts of the limbic system. So all these findings were suggesting that there is a core network of human brain regions which possess mirror properties associated with action observation and execution. And that there would be some additional areas which are recruited during tasks that engage in non-motor functions, such as would be the auditory, somatosensory, and affective component. Okay, let's move to the next methodology. Now, we have some neurophysiological studies as well using electroencephalography, EEG, to support this claim. Most of them, they've used what it's called the mu rhythm. This is a frequency between 8 and 13 hertz, and it's a rhythm generated by the sensory motor cortex. This is most prominent when subjects are resting, and it gets attenuated or abolished when the subjects move or observe biological movements. So in a study from Muthukumaraswamy et al. In 2004, they found that the human sensory motor move rhythm might be maybe an index of the activity of the brain system comparable to this mirror-neuron system in monkeys. Another study from Padbar et al. In 2013 was using mu suppression as well, and they stated that mu suppression involves a range of structures that would modulate the motor preparation activities and that are sensitive to the visual input. So this would include, but not be restricted to, the human analog of this mirror neuron system in monkeys. There is another study with EEG done by Ulloa and Pineda in 2007, and they showed that changes in the power in mu frequency band is thought to indirectly reflect the activity of mirror neurons in premotor cortex. They found that the activation of these neurons by self-performed, observed, or imagined motor actions is assumed to produce asynchronous firing and a reduction in this mu rhythm oscillation, which is referred as mu suppression in the somatosensory cortex. Now, so we have some evidence coming from TMS studies, fMRI studies, EEG studies, but the discovery in mirror neurons was done with single cell recording, okay, which is a very different methodology. And so this is pretty good evidence, but it's still not as good, right? So let's see the last study here. Finally, in 2010, we got a study from Mukemal et al. Using single neuron recording, and they found a significant proportion of neurons in the supplementary motor area, hippocampus, and other areas, which were responding to both observation and execution of these actions. So with this study, we can confirm the existence of neurons in humans with mirror properties. Okay. Although for some, it remains unclear how similar would this be to the mirror neural system in monkeys. But was that the end of it? No. Now we've seen the framework, we've seen the discovery of mirror neurons, what are their properties, whether there's enough evidence to show that they also exist in humans. Now let's move to the action observation network. What is this and what is it adding? Basically, yeah, at the same time that all that research was done trying to prove the existence of a mirror neural system in humans, there was a parallel line of studies. They were looking at similar properties in the human brain, but just framing it as the action observation network. It describes a network of areas that participate both in action observation, that participate mainly in action observation, okay? It will include areas like the parietal and premotor cortices that we've been seeing with the mirror neurons, and which are involved in both doing and seeing actions, as well as other areas involved only in seeing actions, okay, like the superior temporal sulcus. So, exploring a bit further in this network, there was one study by Bucchino and colleagues in 2001, where they found that there was a somatotopic organization of the premotor cortex. during action observation, okay? And that this somatotopic representation in the premotor cortex during action observation was very similar to the one previously found in the motor cortex while action execution, okay? So this was a major improvement in motor research, but we are still trying to answer so many questions, no? Like how specific or how critical is the role of these areas for action understanding in general. So for this purpose, I'm going to try to clarify a bit more, and over the next slides, we will see a couple of studies from Beatriz Calvo-Merino, which will introduce us to the role of motor experience, motor familiarity in action observation. Okay, so there's so many things that we can take into account when we are exploring action observation, action understanding. Okay, let's see. The first one from her studies is, well, this first one here is from 2005. It was looking at different activations of the motor representation when we were when looking at either capoeira or ballet moves. So they were basically, in this paper, they were basically comparing the brain activity when dancers watch their own dance versus the other style, okay? And they were trying, with this, they were trying to reveal what was the influence of the motor expertise on action observation. The results basically showed that this mirror system integrates the observed actions of others with the individual's personal motor repertoire. This suggested that the human brain understands action by motor simulation. So from this paper, we can assume that there is a difference due to the level of experience. But still, how could we dissociate that visual and motor experience? So that's what Calvo-Merino explored in her 2006 paper. They were using female-specific and male-specific ballet moves. So basically, they would all have a visual experience with the actions, with the moves, but the motor experience with it would be gender-specific. So they were having female dancers and male dancers watching male-specific and female-specific moves. With this study, they showed that the brain's response to seeing an action depends not only on previous visual knowledge and experience of seeing that action, but also previous motor experience of performing that action. They showed some areas which were activated. Well, they were showing an effect of pure motor expertise. Those areas are the left dorsal premotor cortex, the left inferior parietal sulcus, and the right cerebellum. So, okay, we have now we have an idea of what is action understanding, what is body representation, what was the role of mirror neurons on all these, what we call now the action observation network, all the possible questions and dissociations that we can look into. Now let's try to focus a bit more on body representation. And for that, we're gonna start doing a bit of a catch up on what do we know specifically about body representation, and then what happens if we go beyond perception and some studies from a lab. So basically, when it comes to body representation, we have loads of evidence, and we also have some theories. For example, from cognitive psychology, we have the common coding theory, which supports that there is a shared representation between perception and action. Then we have neurophysiologic studies with animals, with the discovery of mirror neurons, and showing that this population of neurons are activated both when observing and executing that action. So there is this coupling. Then we have neuroimaging studies with humans, where we found an action observation network, which is a distributed network of brain regions that engages when seeing body stimuli, and that it goes beyond the visual cortex. So it is currently well established that both our somatosensory and motor cortices are involved in the perceptual processing of actions and bodies, even though the stimuli can be presented visually, okay? So this is a bit of the idea. It is kind of clear that when it comes to perception, there is a role for this somatosensory and motor cortex. Now, let's try to go beyond perception, okay? Could it be that these areas involved in body representation have also a role beyond perception? Well, to answer that question, we need to look into working memory, okay? Working memory has been defined as the accessible information modulated by memory capacity and locked to the sensory modality in which the information was perceived, okay? From the working memory research literature, we found that there are these sensory recruitment models which assume that the information storage is mediated by the same cortical areas that are responsible for the perceptual processing of the sensory signal. Okay, so being that the somatosensory and motor cortices are involved in the perceptual processing of body-related information, would they also have a role when it comes to encode and maintain in working memory this information? And who made that question? Well, it was Alex, the great host of these e-seminars, during his PhD at the same lab that I'm doing mine now. He found that both the somatosensory and motor cortices are involved in memory processes, and he established as well the EEG method that we're using now in the lab to explore sensory motor engagement when seeing body-related information. So from Alex's studies, we know that the somatosensory cortex is sensitive to memory load when it comes to holding bodily information in memory. But this always brings new questions. So I've been following up from Alex's studies, and what I'm working in during my PhD would be things like how top-down effects may modulate this working memory encoding and maintenance of body-related information, which is the same as asking, could different attended features modulate the degree in which we embody the same stimuli? Well, that is what I explored during my first EEG experiment in the PhD. But there are also there's so many questions still to answer. So another would be, does this sensory motor response just reflect an ongoing carryover activity that correlates with the visual memory mechanism, or does it play a functional and crucial role on visual memory for body information? So that was going to be a TMS study. Well, that is a TMS study already designed, and it's called Investigating Motor Encoding of Body-Related Information Using DMS. But it's not going to happen anytime soon due to the pandemic. So let's say that these and more questions remain unanswered. And with all this uncertainty, we came to the end of the seminar. So thank you very much for your time. And I hope that you enjoyed the seminar and find it interesting. Thanks.